Okay. Oh my God. Okay, sorry about that. We're back after everything went wrong. I think we're back. I think they can hear you. I hope they can hear you. Chat, can you? Yeah, I know, Garwar. I know you. I know it was a hot mic because I was.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, let's see. Let's see.
Mitra, can you hear me?
Okay, we're back there. I see my face. I will edit all of this part out. We'll just do a thing later. Okay. Yes, they can hear all three. Okay.
Oh, thank goodness.
Round 2, ready, fight. What's up and welcome to Champions of Psychology, a show with the goal of openly talking about mental health and gaming presented by Codename Entertainment and TakeThis.org. Every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on twitch.tv/CNE Games or later on your favorite podcast service, Mitra Jordan and Raffael Boccamazzo, aka Dr. B, talk about mental health and in these unprecedented times as well as how gaming affects us. If you hear us live in the chat, you can leave a question that Dr. B is going to ask us later, but before that, who are you fine folks for people who may not know?
Okay, I'll start. So I'm a therapist in Victoria, BC. I play games. I love games. I often end up working with clients, bringing somehow games into therapy or therapy into games. Hard to say. Anyway, I work with families, individuals, often with couples, and I think that's sufficient. Oh, and I have ADHD. Can you tell from this intro? Anyway, I have ADHD. We're going to be talking all about that today.
Yes.
Good to see you, everyone.
I was really hoping that the pictures didn't get switched in time.
I didn't notice it. I didn't notice it.
If you look above right here, I am Dr. Raffael Boccamazzo.
I gotta change the date and everything. I'm gonna do this while you do your intro.
Okay. Well, hi everybody.
For audio listeners, this has been a morning.
The visual gags are wonderful. But I'm Dr. Raffael Boccamazzo, better known as Dr. B for long Italian name reasons. And I'm a doctor of clinical psychology. I am the clinical director at TakeThis.org, the first mental health nonprofit that serves the gaming community, do a lot of behind the scenes education, actually in public education too, to destigmatize mental health matters and help y'all basically live your best lives. Additionally, I am an expert on the applied use of role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons in clinical and applied learning settings. I sometimes train clinicians and teachers on how to do that. And I'm often found here goofing off and simultaneously talking about, psychology topics. So,
once again, everybody in the chat, really sorry about everything that was going on there. Completely my fault. No idea my computer had a gremlin in it, and I kicked its butt out of here. So hopefully, at least I hope it doesn't come back. This is going to go on a little bit longer. We're going to go for our normal time because we do want to give this topic its time. And the other streams today have been postponed, so we're going to take the time and give this what it needs. This is an ADHD AMA, and the way that this is going to work, if you're present last week for the autism one that Dr. B led, Mitra and I, we both have ADHD, and we are going to talk about our experiences with it as well as what that actually means to have ADHD. And then we're going to take our little disclaimer break in the middle, and then after that, we'll do an AMA. Dr. B is going to have access to a document where he can read questions that you can leave in chat right now. Leave them throughout the episode, and we'll gather them up, and Dr. B can ask us it in the second half of the show. For the first part, we're just talking about our stories. And Mitra, I would love if you actually started.
Okay, so why don't I start by defining ADHD for people? A little bit, at least. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder or condition. It means that those of us who have ADHD or deal with it on an ongoing basis are also neurodivergent. So not neurotypical, like most people. What ADHD involves is 3 different subtypes. So you can have ADHD with hyperactivity, impulsivity. You can have ADHD with inattention, or you can have a combined subtype, which is probably the most common one, where you experience some hyperactivity and some inattention as well. ADHD looks different in boys and girls, which is why as children, girls are often not diagnosed with ADHD because they're not usually hyperactive, and their impulsivity often shows up differently than it does for boys. And I'm going to speak about that in terms of my own experience with it, because my impulsivity as a child showed up in the most typical ways that it does for a girl. And it was completely missed. So I think that's a definition. Please, Dr. B, do jump in if I'm missing anything, because I think that would be pretty helpful for our audience.
Question.
So, yeah.
Question. Why isn't ADHD just spacing out? Because everybody gets forgetful.
Because
sometimes.
that's just me writing, damn it.
Well, no, I'm being a little flippant about this, but and for the sake of things, I also have concurrent with my autism. I also have a lot of ADHD symptoms, as a lot of people on the spectrum do.
Yeah, that overlap is very common.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I actually thought I had ADHD long before I thought I was autistic. But my question, what's the difference? Because everybody's forgetful sometimes. Everybody's forgetful. What's the difference between that and ADHD?
Okay, so everybody's forgetful sometimes. With ADHD, it's showing up in multiple areas of your life. So like, for instance, if I was always forgetful at the office, my inattention or forgetfulness could be due to a number of things. It could be due to trouble with colleagues. ADHD is often concurrent with anxiety and depression. It can sometimes be hard to figure out which came first. And so really, if you're struggling with depression, you might actually have inattention as one of your symptoms. You may even have a little bit of impulsivity as one of your symptoms, particularly true if you're also dealing with anxiety. So it's when ADHD is showing up in multiple, I guess, settings that you experience on a day-to-day basis and is affecting multiple parts of your life, then it's more likely to be a consistent diagnosis and not just, I'm occasionally forgetful, right? So for instance, if you have a kid who's doing super well at school, but they're having forgetfulness or scatterbrained or whatever at home, we might look at what's going on in the home. If it's just happening at home, at school, and everything's fine at home, we might look at what's going on at school. But if it's happening in both settings, and if you're an adult and it's happening in just like, you're forgetful with work things, you're struggling at home to remember errands, groceries, whatever, then it could be ADHD.
So in other words, ADHD isn't just like, oh, ran into the room and this happens once a day and I forgot what I was looking for.
There's a video that came up on Twitter just last week, and I hate that I can't remember who posted it, but I think it was a TikTok where it was like, I'm going to show you what it's like to have forgetfulness with ADHD. And it was somebody going, oh, I left my wallet in the car. And they walked to the front door and they're like, wait, why was I going out to the front door? Oh, right. Well, okay. And then they go out to there and then they stop. They're like, oh, look, my mail's here. All right, better take this back inside. Oh, no, my wallet. And then they go to their car and they open up the car and they get in there and they're just like, why did I come in here? Oh, I left my soda in here. Sweet. And they just leave. And then they get all the way back into their house and they're just like, freaking wallet.
Exactly.
And that happens all the time across multiple domains.
Yes.
Exactly. And the other thing is, so sometimes people confuse ADHD can co-occur with other things that cause inattention. And there are other things that cause inattention that can look like ADHD. So very quickly, I'm going to look at, say, complex post-traumatic disorder, or a recent issue with trauma, or a recent bereavement, right? So what we're also looking for is like consistency over time. Yeah. So because if you've gone through something traumatic, it might be that you do have issues around being scattered because obviously your brain is overloaded and you're managing a traumatic experience, car accidents, for example, and bringing that up, we can look at issues with like concussions. So brain injury can absolutely look like ADHD, but what we're looking at is how are things historically? Has this occurred over your lifespan? Because I can assure you it has for me.
Yeah.
And so you start to winnow out, oh, wait a second. No, it's not to do with bereavement or just depression, And so we get to that diagnosis. So it's really important to talk to a doctor, a therapist, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, someone who is in a position to help you assess what's happening and whether it's actually ADHD.
Yeah. So why don't we get into your experiences with ADHD and being diagnosed?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
You get comfortable here. Have a sip of my tea.
Well, because I mean, Mitra, you really specifically said that you had the typical, girl presentation for ADHD.
So
what does that mean?
Okay, so as a child, I learned to read really young. I started to read at age 4. I was super verbal and super quick, and certainly looking at me, you wouldn't have thought that there was really any issue in terms of managing cognitive load. What started to become pretty clear for me was that I was also kind of a chatterbox and kind of rebellious. And those are the two main symptoms, two main behavioral patterns that we would look at in ADHD with a girl. The other thing was I did have meltdowns. I did have times where I would get a little rigid in my thinking around wanting something to happen or expecting something to happen. Maybe I was told we were going to get ice cream, and then for whatever reason, we couldn't get ice cream. Now, every kid will occasionally have a meltdown about that. But what I noticed about that was like, there was definitely a hyper focus or fixation on something that I wanted that maybe would lead to some kind of breakdown. The daydreaming, which is again how inattention often shows up with ADHD, particularly I think with both genders, but certainly it's a strong one with women and girls. So just going off in my head, lovely place. And if you look at my report cards from my childhood, it often says, she lacks application, there's a lot of daydreaming, and if there was something that I couldn't focus on in class, I'd go off in my head. I mean, I was definitely the kid who during math class was reading comic books under her desk. So that capacity to clearly focus on things that interested me and that I understood was there, and the capacity to not do that with tough topics that were just a little bit more of a cognitive load. And you can say with kids, okay, but how do we know it's ADHD if like she's able to focus there? Why doesn't she just apply herself over here? Because that's a common criticism that parents come up with. How can it be ADHD if you can focus? And it actually took me a long time to figure out in my own experience of it, because it's true, I could be super focused. The difference is when you hyper focus in that way, and this is true of most people with ADHD, is you have no concept of time. Time vanishes. Time doesn't exist. And this isn't true of other people and their capacity to focus. They can sometimes task switch better than someone with ADHD can. And they can usually manage their time better. So there's a kind of rabbit hole that's super easy to go down. And I've experienced this my whole life and certainly didn't know what to call it. But if I'm super focused on something, I also could get super irritable if someone tried to interrupt me. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like it's okay to switch a task. It's like, leave me alone. And that's the internal sense of it. Mm-hmm. So, and lateness. Lateness is another big thing that people with ADHD often struggle with. And I certainly did. And I had a lot of judgment about myself around that.
Well, one question I have for Mitra and Treavor, I know you're going to want to chime in on this as well, is that I've heard a growing criticism over even the name attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, when the truth of the matter is it's not a deficit of attention. It's it's difficulties regulating that attention, because that executive function, that frontal lobe stuff is so disrupted that you're not. It's amazing how many people are able to selectively ignore things and direct their attention willfully. But in ADHD and to a large degree in autism, that's really the issue. Not a lack of attention, but a lack of ability to regulate it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's the big misunderstanding. So that capacity to regulate attention diminishes as your cognitive load increases. So either there's more things going on around you and you're noticing them all. And your capacity to focus on the ones that actually matter in that moment becomes harder and harder to do. And your ability to filter out, as I say, you're noticing it all, also becomes much harder to do. And the more tired you get, the more difficult that is. And so the capacity to even keep attending to the things you want to do can also really suffer. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So for me, I didn't actually figure out I had and was dealing with ADHD until later in life. And it was actually because of one of my kids was figuring out they were ADHD. And then I started to look at the pattern. And I even talked to my mom, who also has struggled with ADHD her entire life. And so once we started putting this generational picture together, it was really helpful, I think, to all three of us. But in my experience, so there was the lateness. I really struggled with that a lot. I had to put so many prompts in place in order to manage my time and also my attention to get things done. And I did notice some days it was much, much easier if I'd had a good night's sleep, for example. And sleep regulation is another problem with ADHD. So when I say I had a good night's sleep, there were times when focusing on getting enough sleep was really problematic. And this again comes back to what we've talked about in terms of regulation and the cognitive load that you can experience, is that you stop having the capacity to make good decisions when you get overloaded. And so you can be tired, but you can be hyper focusing on something, and you can stay up far too late surfing the net for this one topic thing you're wanting to buy or do, whatever it is, hobby. And before you know it, it's like 2 a.m. And your capacity then to manage your energy, to come down enough to sleep is compromised. So it just messes with everything until you figure out tools to manage it better. So
that's really the thing a lot of people don't understand, is the degree of impact.
Yeah.
Should I talk about my thing?
Jump in.
So I got diagnosed with, unlike you, I got diagnosed when I was a kid. 1994, first grade, literally second week of school. My teacher pulled my mom aside and was just like, "Hey, you should get this kid checked out." And the wild thing for me is I didn't really learn what that meant until this year. Like, I was essentially told, and this is not my parents' fault, because this is what the doctors told them. The doctors were just like, "Yeah, he's super hyper and he doesn't pay attention well. Here's Ritalin." And like, here's a wild one that I realized this morning. I learned what a zombie was because of it being how someone described me when I was on Ritalin. That's how I found out what a zombie was. Like, yeah, I would take Ritalin and I would just completely just not be hyper. People who have watched the show for, listeners and whatnot, there was times in school when teachers go, "Oh, I marked you as absent because I didn't realize you were here." Me. But yeah, no, like I had learning about what ADHD is this year was one of those eye-opening moments. And I'm gonna call somebody out in the chat who just put in there, but it was when Mitra was talking, it was like, "Or you were just a kid." No. You sound like my uncle, and I don't mean that as a compliment. Essentially what it is yes, kids have that. Kids have temper tantrum, kids have breakdowns and all that stuff, but it continues. And throughout my adult life, I was like, why am I freaking out so hard about this one thing? Why am I so fixated on this thing that I start acting like a freaking child? And then to find out what it is, and to find out that it was something that I know that I've had, that I'm going to continue to have, and that all of those things that friends were just like, "Just try this, just do this, just do that," doesn't work, sucked.
Yeah.
Actually finding out what ADHD was this year sucked for me, because it was like all that effort I put in to try and get better about this is why it's not working, and this is why it's going to be even harder than it already is.
Well, and this is something that a lot of people don't understand necessarily, is it's essentially similar to autism. It's essentially your brain being on a different operating system.
Yeah.
And the typical tricks for neurotypical brains don't always work for ADHD.
Yeah, and let me give you an example of how it is different than just being a kid. So I have 3 kids. I have 2 have ADHD, and it presents very differently for both of them, and 1 does not. And I've worked with countless kids and youth, and I've worked with many who don't have ADHD, obviously, and adults too. And the difference in my personal felt experience of it is that that capacity to regulate your emotions can manifest differently for kids, as in some will not act out, some will act in and kind of shut down. So it's not just that you can't regulate your emotions like a normal person, but that the intensity of the emotional up and down doesn't change even when you're really regulated. I've done years of Zen meditation. I'm a super regulated person, and my internal world is still a different place
Yeah.
than a neurotypical person.
Yeah.
And the way I really understood that was I always, my whole life, have had issues with time. It's become better as I've gotten older. Certainly as a therapist, it's hour by hour, and I very much know how I'm structuring my hour with a client based on their needs, and I'm on time. But it's still a process to have to really work to do that. And as soon as I started taking medication, it's like the problem cleared up. So, and it wasn't me that noticed that, it was my friends.
Yeah.
Because they were like, wow, you're on time. And after a week or 2 of this, I said to them, yeah, I've been on meds. And they're like, oh my God. So that's how your brain can change in terms of that greater capacity to focus, a little bit more dopamine and norepinephrine in your synapse, because your body and your brain generally are making a bit too little dopamine and norepinephrine. So when you get medication that allows you to increase, because it's stimulant medication, the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine present, you function differently. Now, it's not for everyone, but it did make a difference for me.
Well, that's a thing that a lot of I've back in the days when I used to work with people, I would do a lot of psychoeducation, which I found out that a lot of other mental health professionals didn't always do. The amount of people, the amount of teenagers I worked with who, much like Treavor, had a diagnosis for a long time and didn't know what that diagnosis meant at all because nobody ever explained it to them, was staggering to me. But one of the things that a lot of folks don't seem to understand with ADHD stimulant medications is the reason they have a counterintuitive effect is because the brain is essentially underfiring to regulate that attention. And by boosting the ability to function, that regulation happens better, and then a person kind of comes down a little bit. It's really counterintuitive. But it's incredible when it works.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like I remember how many times in school, teachers would be like, well, you're so, fixated on this. Why can't you apply that to that? And I'm just like, I don't know. I can recite to you way too much Star Wars lore that I don't need to know about. But when it comes to Waiting for Godot, I got zero interest, man.
In fairness, Waiting for Godot, I mean, French, an English translation of French absurdism.
Yeah. But yeah, no, that like, I was actually the opposite of Mitra, where like I didn't read, and that was because I'm pretty sure, like, this is the undiagnosed one, but like I'm pretty sure I had dyslexia because I couldn't tell the difference between a B and a D until I was in 6th grade. And so reading wasn't my thing until, again, going back to last week with Dr. B, it just had to be this freaking franchise until Harry Potter, and I got hyper fixated on it. I think that was one of the first times that I can really pinpoint and went, boom, hyperfixation right there, because I tore through those books and read them at every chance that I was sitting still. And the most hilarious part was, for years, teachers was like, we just want you to read. Just read. And then I started reading, and they're like, you're reading too much. And I was like, okay, you need to make up your mind.
Can't just do anything right. Yeah, I had the same issue you had with reading, I had with numbers.
Yeah.
I really struggled to understand and not so much how equations worked, weirdly, because they're more like language.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of got that. But there's a lot of things to do with numbers and math that I struggled with my whole life and still do. To get through master's level statistics, I had to hire a tutor. And by the time I was doing that, I didn't actually still realize I had ADHD, but I did realize that I was going to need additional tools.
Mm-hmm.
And I had come to a place in my life where I was fine with that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there was a lot of judgment prior to that, oh, everybody else seems like everybody else can do this stuff and I can't.
Yep.
And it's really confusing for a person if they're really intelligent in some ways and grasping certain kinds, because intelligence, of course, there's several different kinds of intelligence, right? So certainly for me, reading, comprehension, being able to synthesize material and send it back out there in a way that other people could understand it, that's a real strength.
Mm-hmm.
But the numbers thing was a huge weakness, and that often will happen with ADHD as well.
Well, and the
happens
research
with many things, but
the research supports that because essentially narrowing down your field of attention is convergent thinking, which that's what people with ADHD tend to struggle with. And again, a lot of us on the spectrum too, because we have strong ADHD like symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Divergent thinking, which is going off on a tangent, looking at things sideways, aka creativity, real good at that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes I'll get a client in the office and they'll be like, oh, I'm just all over the place. And I'm thinking, fantastic. I got it all. I'm here and I hear all of it. And don't you worry, because I will synthesize it for you at the end if that's what you need. Because I have no trouble with that and I never have. So, yeah. Neither you, Trevor, you really hold the space as a host. And I see that. And I see, the connection there with that.
I'm just so hyper all the
time. So what do you do to manage it, Trevor? Like, what do you do? Because if first of all, given there's 3 different types, there's inattentive type, which is the daydreaming type. You've got the hyperactive type, which is probably what most people think of when they think of ADHD. And then of course there's the combined type, which Mitra mentioned, which is what I am.
Yeah, which is what I am, because I remember later on after first grade we saw another doctor and they're like, yeah, he's on the cusp of the hyperactive one. It was back when they still were doing ADD and ADHD, and now it's just ADHD. But no, I've got both of them because I will bounce around this freaking house, just going off the rails. And then there'll be other days where I'm just sitting there plotting out an entire book series, staring at a wall. And I was actually driving yesterday, and 2 songs came up that really kind of hit this ADHD thought of mine. There's a song, and it's funny because you did last week with Revolution 9 for autism. There's a song called it's a funny song. It's called 4 Chords by Axis of Awesome.
Oh yeah.
That is how my brain is constantly, where I am going from one song to the next, and there is a through line between all of it, and you don't realize what it is until someone points out that it's like, oh, those are the same 4 chords through the entire song.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now there's another song that came up while I was driving that's from Italy. It got really big on Twitter last year, where this Italian singer was just like, people in Italy only like the sound of English songs, not what they're actually saying.
Yes,
so I'm going to sing a song in gibberish that sounds like
words.
English. That's what it's like for me learning. It is like I have 4 chords playing while someone's trying to get me to learn the words of that song that is gibberish.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. That's the best I can explain it to you. I have something constantly going in my head, no matter what you are saying, unless I am hyper focused on what you're saying, at which point, welcome to Hyper Trevorville. If it's not, I'm thinking a billion things a moment. Like that, we talked about this a while ago when you were talking about Newt Scamander with the autism thing. Like, I brought up Doctor Who because of the times where like Matt Smith, when he just starts rambling off things and then goes from point to point to point to point to point to point to point, and I'm like, that sounds like me trying to explain something.
Yeah. I have had to really rein myself in terms of explanations. And, you know, you may notice that in my explanations, but there's a piece where my mind wants to kind of go off in metaphor as well. And depending on who I'm working with, that may or may not work at all. So I will often, I'll occasionally at least find myself saying, okay, wait, okay, drop that. Let's just get to, it's like this.
Yes.
You know, yeah, because I don't want to. And one thing that I never realized that was related to ADHD in my experience of it is that I've always had a terrible time with music, with lyrics, if I'm trying to focus on a conversation.
Yes.
And it makes me crazy that people just feel totally fine to just chat away when there's something with lyrics on, because I can't attend to them. And for example, if I'm saying to someone, oh, hey, this is this awesome song, you know, I'd love you to listen to it, and I play it for them. And then 3 minutes into the song, they turn to me and they start to have a conversation.
Feel called out.
This is why I used to constantly drive around like listening to soundtracks, and somebody get in my car and like, Treavor, this is the 3rd week with the Halo 3 soundtrack. Can we maybe do something else? Yeah, no, totally. We'll tell you what, let's take a break here, remind the viewers and listeners of our disclaimer, and then we'll come back with some questions. How's that sound? All right, we'll be right back.
Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.
Okay, so this is normally the part where I start asking questions, but I'm not, and it's weird. So I'm just gonna sit back from my laptop. Dr. B, do you have some questions for us?
Hi, I'm Treavor. Well, yes, Mitra and Dr. B. I asked Dr. B, you're looking particularly handsome today.
I don't have nearly enough bow ties, vest, and hat to be as cool as you. Don't even try.
Oh, yeah, actually we've got a lot of really great questions, because you two are hitting on a lot of things that are resonating with our audience, which thank you for being here, by the way. And
yes,
this is a much inflated audience size, so thank you all for joining us. Let's start with this one. From Dark Cyril. And Dark Cyril, I'm going to paraphrase for the sake of time.
Mm-hmm.
And Dark Cyril said that more and more people are being diagnosed with ADHD that never had any significant behavioral problems growing up. And no, I'm just going to say, as someone who was screened a few years back and was told that because they didn't have significant behavioral issues growing up, is there any truth to this? Essentially, being told that because didn't have behavioral issues, can't have ADHD. What's up with that?
I'll start with that, because I absolutely flew under the radar, and I'm a very functional person. So you wouldn't look at me and think, oh yeah, she's got ADHD. My husband wouldn't have figured out I had ADHD. My kids would have had no idea, okay? Because particularly for women, it often goes invisible in terms of how other people perceive us. And there's 2 reasons for that. And one is the amount of work we typically do to manage our symptoms. And 2 is the amount of energy girls and women generally put into appearing socially appropriate. There is, first of all, the way girls' brains develop is different than boys. We're actually more emotionally aware, and it's just a different part of the brain development. Boys are more spatially aware, girls are more emotionally aware. It's just part of early developmental processes. It's not to say men and boys can't be just as emotionally aware and girls can't be just as spatially aware. I need to throw that in there. But so from a young age, you're told how to behave. And I grew up in a culture, certainly, that was somewhat patriarchal. And so there were some very strong ideas about how women and girls behave. And it's a culture where you're also taught to sit still as a child. There's a massive expectation in young childhood to learn to sit still and behave.
Oh my God.
So as a girl who doesn't want to do the wrong thing, you really control that side of you. And I was still impulsive and somewhat rebellious, okay? So I did find myself standing in the corner a few times. Probably the only girl in class to stand in the corner, by the way, related to the boys quite a bit. But in any case, the point is, I worked hard my whole life to manage and suppress these symptoms. The way they came out was I moved pretty much every year. I switched jobs. I lost jobs quite frequently. I had the capacity to hold on to jobs I loved, but there was definitely this process of I'm not going to quit. This time, I'm not going to quit. This time, no quitting. First and second year university, I bombed out and was debarred for a year. And I have a master's degree and 2 undergraduate degrees, people, okay? But that's what my first couple of years of university were like.
Mm-hmm.
What also masked ADHD for me is I'm an immigrant who has lived in multiple countries on multiple continents. And so there was this process of having to adjust to new places. But anyone who knew me in my childhood and my early teens would certainly not have thought of me as a good student. I was easily distractible in class, and I would sometimes distract others. So over time and through my life, I got better at controlling all this, but it was all going on inside all the time. It was an all singing, all dancing cabaret cast in there that I was continually having to suppress in order to manage.
Mm-hmm.
So on the surface, I looked like the other ducks, but to go the same speed, I was paddling 6 times as hard in there.
Yeah.
And routinely I'll hear people with ADHD say things like, other people seem to be able to do this thing. Why can't I? No one knows how hard you're working. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I'll put in there as the resident, not a professional. Essentially what I'd say to Dark Sail, it sounds like you need to find another person to screen you, because if that doctor is only interested in what you did as a child, they also don't know what ADHD is.
Yes.
And that's actually, I need to chime. I feel the urge to chime in here, because I also have impulse control issues. One of the things that is super common within the field of diagnostics, whether it's general practitioners or even therapists, the amount of people who truly specialize in adult ADHD as well as adult autism is very, very limited. And so while a lot of people might be comfortable with it as a general diagnosis, the amount of people who will understand the nuances of diagnosing something like that, it took me, I mean, it took me months to find somebody who was specialized in adult autism to get my diagnosis. There were some other challenges there, but a lot of the people who are doing diagnostics have a really limited understanding of the nuances of especially adult ADHD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you, Dark Soul. That was a good question.
And I'm gonna. There's actually a couple of questions touching on this, so I'm gonna combine them from the chat.
Sounds good.
That there's a lot of talk about ADHD, not necessarily as a mental illness, but in terms of being a different, as a neurodevelopmental disorder, being on a different operating system.
Mm-hmm.
Are there, some people talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Is there any truth to the idea of advantages and disadvantages? And are there any downsides to focusing on the advantages that seem to come from kind of a privileged position?
You mind if I start this one?
Go for
yeah,
it.
no, I totally think there are. Like, I do think there's advantages and disadvantages. I also think that there is, it's not great to like highlight that. Like, I don't know, because I've heard a couple people call like ADHD like a superpower, and like it sort of is, but it's like at the same time though, like it sucks because one of the other podcasts I'm on, we talk about writing, and one of the things that I've said is one of the worst things that could possibly happen to me while writing a book is get hyperfixated on a different genre. If I'm writing urban fantasy and I suddenly get you see a sci-fi movie or something and I get hyper focused on that sci-fi and want to write nothing but sci-fi, it is going to be a slog for me to get back to that book.
Yep.
But at the same time, if I do get hyper fixated on the book that I am currently working on, I can bang out 20,000 words in a day, which I did one time, and my hands hurt. And it like there's good stuff to it, but it also comes with like a big disadvantage too. It and you have no control over it, so that's why it's not quite a superpower to me. Because if I could control my hyper focus, oh man, I would have learned how to draw this quarantine, y'all. I would be an artist. I'm not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does have its advantages and disadvantages when it works. When it works,
Yeah.
it has its advantages, but it mostly has its disadvantages.
I can agree with that. I think particularly when you talk about that creative process and being sidetracked by another idea, by another inspiration, that can really hijack the work that you've done. Absolutely. There are ways to stay on track. I had to do it through a 3-year degree while I had very young children. But really, one of the things that kept me on track was recognizing that my family was making sacrifices and having to continually
Yeah.
come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't have things tethering you, it's going to get immensely difficult, because my head is a spacious universe. It's a freaking galaxy, and I can go off from planet to planet,
Yes.
and it's not easy. And I will say, one of the beautiful things about being a therapist is I have no trouble focusing on clients. When someone is before me, like that for me is I am there. I am containing the space and fully present. And it's a lovely experience, because the more we have of that in our lives, the better we usually feel. So the hyper focus can be great when you're trying to learn something. If you're engaged in what you're learning, it can profoundly interfere with other tasks that need doing.
Yeah.
My husband will be the first to tell you, I'm terrible at filling out forms. But when one of my kids was going through a medical condition and a lot of issues that were really tough for them, I filled out every form, no problem.
Yeah.
So part of it is, in fact, just like anyone, figuring out the motivational piece. But the other part is recognizing that your capacity to be diverted is that much greater. It is really a different thing than just normal, everyday, I'm struggling with inattention.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and that touches on, I mean, we've got so many questions that intersect in terms of their themes, and a lot of them touch on this. One, what is really the difference between normal inattention and suspecting one has ADHD? And if one suspects one has ADHD, how do you go about finding out?
Okay, I'll address the first question. Normal inattention is not persistent through time and place, through your lifetime. It comes and goes based on what's happening in your life. I'm working this job, I'm bored. Yes, I'll have inattention. I'm struggling with something in terms of bereavement, loss, depression, anxiety. I experience seasonal affective disorder and we're getting into fall. Maybe I'll have more inattention. That's different than the consistent, persistent, long-term experience of inattention over anything that you might do. I could love what I'm doing and go through inattention with it. That's not typical. Unless you're also struggling with like bereavement or something, then it's hard to love things.
I think one of the most wild things for me to have ever heard was someone like, oh yeah, you know, I was just spacing out, not thinking about anything. And I went, what?
Yeah.
You weren't thinking about anything?
Yeah, never happened.
That doesn't make any sense to me in any way, shape, or form. If I'm staring at a wall, I'm constantly thinking about something.
Maybe
Like, I
several
may
somethings
look
in one go.
inattentive, but that's because I am thinking about so many things.
So I have a really good friend, super person, professor, highly intelligent, and she said to me, "Yeah, when I'm on a plane, I can just sit there. I don't need to like
Oh,
read or
God.
do something." And I'm like, "What fresh hell is this?" Sure, I can space off, but then I'm in a million other places. But to just sit there with absolutely nothing.
Y'all should see my carry-on on a plane. Like, it's got at least 3
Yes.
books. It's got a game system. It's got a charger from my phone because I'm going to need it. Yeah.
Okay, let's say this has been an issue throughout your entire life. Okay, you've struggled to attend to certain things. You have difficulty across all aspects of your life, switching tasks and focusing consistently. You struggle with high intensity things like filling out forms. And this is constantly getting in your way to the point that it impairs your ability to function in a way that's expected. How does one go about seeing if they have ADHD?
Well, the first thing is, of course, as you've said, figuring it out for oneself and coming to a place where you can articulate it. I would check in with people in your life as well to see what they've noticed, because it's really helpful for people who are close to you to chime in with their experience of you as well. And then, I'd start by talking with a therapist about it or talking with your GP. So sometimes here in Canada, general practitioner, family doctor. Sometimes here in Canada, your GP will get you to fill out a questionnaire, and then they might either refer you to psychiatrists. But that gets difficult actually here in Canada because you could be waiting a long time. If you have a GP you've been working with for some time, if you're lucky enough, because that can be a challenge, they may actually just prescribe. They may talk to you, obviously, and work it through. But if you're an adult, they might just say, great, you can try a stimulant medication. And the most common one they'll give you is Ritalin and a relatively low dose.
Mm-hmm.
And a low dose of Ritalin is going to be in your system, actually even a high dose, is going to be in your system for a maximum of 4 hours.
You're talking about the immediate release methylphenidate? The
immediate release methylphenidate versus the slow release, which will be in your system for 6 to 8 hours. So you can try it in those circumstances where it's managed by your doctor and where you've looked at any interactions, drug interactions, of course, and it may or may not make a difference. But if it does make a difference, it's going to be really interesting for you to notice that and figure out what kind of, did you want to medicate or what other things might you want to do? And they may have other suggestions for you that might work. There's a lot of people, you included, Treavor, who have chosen not to use medication as their kind of strategy, which I think there's always a need for other strategies regardless of medication.
I will say I'm not the great the monument of that, though. I stopped taking it in high school because I thought the pills were, because it wasn't Ritalin, I switched to a different thing, can't remember what it's called. I thought they were making me depressed. No, I just had depression. So I'm not the best barometer for that. I will say though, I real quick, I'm not great on this question because I got diagnosed when I was a kid, so I don't know what to do. But I will say, as a kid, taking Ritalin, because it lasts only 4 hours, I had to take it again at lunch. I got to know every school nurse that ever worked at my schools, and they were all great. That was one of the best parts about
it. So if you're in the United States, the one of the questions we've had come up is like, who can you go to get a diagnosis? Can a licensed mental health counselor do diagnoses? Yeah, they can. Generally, a general practitioner can do diagnoses. A psychiatrist can do diagnoses. LMHC, a licensed mental health counselor can do diagnoses. Clinical psychologists can do diagnoses. In some states, there are licensed clinical social workers who can do diagnoses. It depends on which state you're in. So check out like your local department, your state Department of Health or whatever. But So there's a lot of different possibilities for who can do the diagnoses, but my recommendation to people is, just like with any other medical field, find somebody who specializes in it if you can, to find, because like everybody who has a license to do mental health stuff has some basic training in this, but a lot of the nuances get lost with people who have that basic training. And so, like, when I got my autism diagnosis, I went to someone who specialized in adult autism. And I know they also specialized in adult ADHD as well.
Yeah, because if you come to see me, as a therapist in Canada, in Victoria, BC, I don't diagnose, but I'm gonna know how to screen it out quite well, so that you will have a better sense of what you're struggling with and what it looks like. So I'm gonna look at, could it be bipolar disorder? Because the mania part of bipolar disorder can sometimes look like ADHD, because you're going to get regulation issues in terms of managing mood. I'm going to look at, have you had experiences, traumatic experiences that could be interfering? Complex trauma can look a lot like ADHD. I'm going to look at anxiety and depression and which possibly came first in terms of attentional issues. I'm going to look at recent bereavement. I'm going to look at marital struggles. I'm going to look at family history. Like, all of that plays a part, and you need someone who can help you tease these things apart to make sense of, is it ADHD or is it something else? So, and I'm going to make recommendations. Go see your doctor, see if you can get a CT scan. You know, I've worked with older patients who might be having what looks like, or clients who might look like they're having memory issues, but maybe actually it's nothing to do with that. And it could be ADHD that just was never diagnosed or not, right? But we want to start asking the right kinds of questions so that you can ask those of yourself and your medical practitioners.
So a lot of our, they're just some amazing themes with the questions that we're getting, and I'm combining them for the sake of time.
I would say that we got about time for one more.
Yeah. So what are some resources that exist out there for people who struggle with ADHD, or think they might, or have a loved one that struggles with ADHD?
Oof. Really, I've found it case to case. Like, there's actually a podcast I'm listening to right now. Oh man, it's like Artists with ADHD or something like that. Opera Geek was on it recently, so you can go check out her.
She was.
Yeah. Well, that's actually how I found out, because she tweeted out about it, and I started listening to it. And one of the funniest things I think they say on there is, it is so messed up that structure helps out ADHD people so much, and it is the thing they least want in their life. It is the hardest thing to handle, because, like, okay, here's an example. I don't know if any of you are familiar with bullet journaling. It does not have anything to do with bullets. It's bullet points. I don't know why they call that.
I know it.
Yeah. Bullet journaling. Yeah, it's great. It's cool. It's really fun. And I love sitting there, drawing it out and everything, putting my points and everything. But I will forget to look at it. It will sit there, and I will not look at it. I had a reminder on my phone that said, time to look at your bullet journal. And guess what I ignored?
Yeah. Because you're rebellious.
Nope, because it's my brain is terrible. It's like I would see it and I'd be like, okay, I'll look at it in a moment, and that thought right out of my head.
Yeah. Okay, I'm rebellious.
Yeah. No, mine straight up was just like, I would be like, okay, I'll check it in a moment, and then I'd never think to do it again. My sister, who also has ADHD, recommended me this new thing that I'm doing, where I just have a notepad that has no cover on it sitting on my desk, and I have my week's tasks lined out on it, and so far it's working out. I don't know if it will in 3 weeks. That's kind of the problem.
Yeah, it's true. It's really hard to set up structures. You end up having to switch them up a bit. You end up having to choose really simple ones that work for you. Some people use a tool called Timo.
I saw that in the chat.
So there's a bunch of different online tools that can actually be really helpful. For me, my Apple Watch is actually a real help, weirdly, with this kind of thing. I can set alarms. Smartwatches can be super useful. I have a calendar on my phone, and I have alerts set up when it goes off on my watch, I know how much time I have. So there are tools that have really worked for me, but I'm also good at ignoring them. Sometimes a bedtime reminder will show up and I'll be like, no.
Lol.
So that's the piece where you kind of, if things are working well, you can say, okay, present Mitra, going to bed is a good idea. Future Mitra will thank you. And present Mitra sometimes, and we've met present Mitra before, and she's pretty hedonistic. She's like, let the good times roll.
Oh yeah, if there's one person in my life that gets screwed over, it's future Treavor.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I want to point out there, and just full disclosure, I'm not saying this because we dated, but How to ADHD on YouTube, I think, is one of the best resources out there.
No, her videos made me cry.
Well, and not just
amazing.
that. Yeah. Not just that.
Yeah.
Because I'm intimately familiar with the behind the scenes process, I know she has an entire team of people looking over the science behind it. And so there are a lot. If you want science, she's not a mental health professional, but her stuff at How to ADHD is really anchored in current research. And
I will concur. And I will say, I found it before we met, Dr. B. So, it was one of the first sites that came up when I was doing a search on women and ADHD. But really, what she says applies to anyone who's dealing with ADHD. And it's a really great place to start.
Yeah.
And then as you go through, you will figure out what sites are actually valuable. But in terms of ADHD, honestly, I found Google to be quite a good friend, as opposed to any cancer scares where it's a bad idea.
Oh, jeez.
Well,
yeah.
And I say that with caveats, but
yeah,
I've had I know. Yeah. I think that there are some good resources out there. And what you want to look for is ones that come from mental health organizations or individuals who really are rooting their work in science. So you don't want to just it's not helpful if it's just some anecdotal, well, I have ADHD or I think I do, that's not what we're going for here.
And there are some terms that are currently being thrown around in the neurodivergent space that are actually not rooted in science, but people are really glomming onto them. One of them being rejection sensitivity dysphoria.
Yes.
It's not dysphoria.
We don't.
Actually, How to ADHD does a really good video on that. It's not. Rejection sensitivity is a thing. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria, as the proponent of that term describes it, doesn't really hold up to science. Another one is object impermanence. The way it's being used by ADHD Twitter isn't really what that term means.
No.
So that's why I was like, I advocate.
That's a developmental stage.
Yeah.
Nothing else. And I just want to address the rejection sensitivity, which is perfectly normal. If you're experiencing ADHD, you've experienced a lot of rejection. You may also experience anxiety and depression. I don't know why we want to add dysphoria on there. Why do we want to pathologize people's experience of rejection? That
well,
just seems...
the guy who proposed that term proposed it that it's truly unique to ADHD. And it doesn't have the same overlaps with other disorders like autism or social phobia or depression or anything like that. And that just the research doesn't support that.
No.
Yeah. I actually do, before we start winding out, I do want to point out a question that, because I got the doc still open, is from Hazen. Says, when you, Treavor, found out other people who had ADHD, did it help you knowing you weren't alone? And the reason I call this one out is because Hazen is actually my childhood friend. I know him. He also has ADHD, and legitimately having you as my best friend helped me out, because being able to see someone who was going through the same things as me and vice versa legitimately helped me. So yes, 100% dead.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. Agree as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the whole, like, using ADHD Twitter and ADHD TikTok, like, I think that's so cool, because I'm getting to learn about these things and seeing people have these problems that I have, and just be like, oh my God, okay, it's not just me. Good. Yeah. But
I think I talked about that a little last week with autism, is learning that enough people have it that there's a label for it can actually be really validating for some people.
Yeah. Like I said, towards the beginning of me talking, finding out this year stuff that I had been trying to work on and get better at is because of my ADHD, and it's going to take so much more to work through it, was devastating, but it's also good for me to know, and it is going to help me in the future, because now I know that I need to put more effort into it than just what life hacks on Google is putting into it. It's like, no, it's not going to work for me.
Yeah.
Well, and also, if there was one answer for that, we wouldn't be having this conversation, and I would have no student loans.
That's good. Well played. Well played.
Yeah, I think it is really helpful to know one isn't alone. And I think it's also helpful to understand that ADHD is something that you've struggled with, because otherwise there is continually this idea that I should use more discipline, or I should have more willpower, or why is, what's wrong with me? And it's like, I have a framework for that, and I have some tools, and that does really make a difference to my day-to-day and to my self-esteem as well. So
one last thing I'm gonna say before I get into the outro is, if you do think that you have it, do go get checked out. If you're avoiding it, hey, that's also part of it. Just see if you are cool. If you aren't cool, it is just more knowledge than you had the day before. So you're still going to be the exact same person, legitimately.
yeah,
So
you really are.
You
It
may as
doesn't
well go
change.
find out. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. That is all the time we have for today's discussion. Thank you for sticking with us a little bit over the time so we could get the full episode in here. Darth Vader is making a quick appearance for May the 4th. Mitra, Dr. B, where can people find you on social media?
At Mitra Jordan, as you can see below. And also, I have a website, which at Mitra Jordan would lead you to. It's mitrajordan.com. I'm pretty easy to find.
And I am on all the socials at the Dr. B, TheeDoctor, B as in boy. But also make sure to follow Take This at TakeThis.org on all of the socials, because that's really who I do pretty much all my work with. And yeah, I'm pretty easy to find as well. I'm around. I'm professionally around.
You can find me on the Difficulty Class podcast every Friday, as well as Champions Lore every Monday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, except for yesterday because things came up, so we didn't do it. But next week we'll be there. And you can find me on Twitter at the Treavor. There's an A hiding in there. And tomorrow I'm actually going to be streaming Idle Champions on my personal Twitch channel, twitch.tv/the Treavor. If you're coming there hoping to learn how to play, good luck. I play it. I love it. I'm not the best at it. I'll raid Mars's afterwards, so you can actually learn something. That's happening at 11 a.m. So if you want to come hang out with me, see some Idle Champions, you can check that out. I want to thank Jay for moderating the chat, as always, doing a phenomenal job, grabbing those questions and being awesome as you are. And of course, thank you to Codename Entertainment and Take This for giving us the opportunity to have these discussions, because I genuinely don't think I would have ever gotten to talk about ADHD on something. So thank you. If you missed any part of this show, except for the beginning part where we screwed up, I screwed up, you can listen to it later as a podcast at 2 p.m. on your favorite podcast services. And if you have any suggestions for future topics you'd like us to talk about, send those into championsofpsychology@codenameentertainment.com. Bardic Inspiration is postponed this week, so enjoy the rest of your day. And until next week, take care of yourself.
Champions of Psychology is meant as education and entertainment. It is not a substitute for medical advice or professional counseling. Discussion of mental health topics will be primarily rooted in research and the personal experiences and self-disclosures of the hosts. While we can provide generalized education and possible mental health resources, we cannot offer any recommendations, advice, or opinions for any specific persons, cases, or situations. We provide these resources and links at our sole discretion, but have not necessarily vetted or reviewed any resource. We assume no liability for the use of the information or resources on these sites, and we encourage you to use your own best judgment.